I guess it's true that great design is timeless, even if it takes a ton of time to get there. Technically speaking, this piece is over 120 years in the making, so here's hoping nothing falls off the rails in the final stretch. So far, the cabinet's taking shape nicely, at least on the outside. I've still got some of the trickiest sections of the build to tackle, especially when it comes to incorporating the design that flourishes and makes people think Frank Lloyd Wright was here. But I also have to do it in a way that doesn't look like I'm just tacking on random Wright-inspired details. That's where the real balancing act comes in, weaving in classic Wright motifs and touches while staying true to my own design identity. So the first step in this leg of the build process is to glue in a few spacers to allow the cabinet drawers to clear the cabinet doors. If you recall from last time, this cabinet isn't directly mimicking Wright's furniture. Most of his pieces were built-ins. So my approach is more about capturing the feel or the architectural essence that made his work instantly recognizable. That means drawing on elements like strong horizontal lines, geometric patterns, and an internal flow that suggests unity throughout the structure. Think clean lines that give a sense of movement, but also balance that makes everything feel cohesive. When I say this piece is over 120 years in the making, that's partly because Frank Lloyd Wright's influence began early in the 20th century. And it's also a nod to how much time it can take to refine design ideas into something that stands the test of time. Because as we all know, there's nothing timeless about a piece that leaks or falls apart, right? So with my case and clamps, next it was time to tackle some of the decorative additions to the front of the doors as well as the drawers. And the first thing I need to do is route in a 1/4 inch groove across the front of my doors to accept some 1/4 inch strips of walnut. These will create some dynamic vertical and horizontal lines in the design. I also want these strips to sit off the door fronts so that as light is cast across the piece, we get some dramatic shadows as well. Once I've routed in my grooves using a template to keep things on track, I used a couple of chisels to round off the ends left by the bit, then I can move on to tackling the drawer boxes. Thanks to good referential measurement in the previous section of the project, my drawers are going to be exactly the same size, so that cuts down on the number of setups moving forward. Once I have the exact height for my drawer boxes in hand, I can head over to the table saw to rip down the already milled lumber. So my drawer boxes are going to be constructed of 1/2 inch thick walnut and hard maple. Since I've already established my design for the joinery for this piece utilizing box joints, the plan here is to carry on that trend. And I think the combination of walnut and maple will add a ton of contrast to that element. Once I have all my drawer parts ripped to final height, I can next trim them down to their final width. Now, in this case, I'm going to add a 1/16 of an inch to my overall length to allow for my box joints to sit a 32nd of an inch proud on all sides. This way I can flush them up after the boxes have been glued up, and I'll get a super clean fit. Now, in part 1 of this build, I used my table saw to create box joints for the outer carcass, but since these parts are much smaller than those, this time I'm going to opt for using my pantser router instead. And I like the pantser router here for a few reasons. One, it can cut both sides of my joint at the same time, which cuts down on the amount of time it takes to create the joints. Two, because I'm cutting both workpieces at the same time, the joinery is going to line up perfectly. And three, once the machine is set up, it's super easy to repeat all those cuts. Since I'm going with 1/2 inch box joints and my boards are cut to an even 4 inch width, all I have to do to cut both joints at once is use a 1/2 inch spacer on my bottom board against the fence. Once I have the length of the cut dialed in, again 1/32 over, I can use my box joint templates and a 1/2 inch bit to make the cuts. Here, I'm just careful to number each section so that they align properly and pay attention to their orientation. But with this setup, in no time at all, I have all 4 box joints for both of my boxes trimmed out and ready for the bottom groove. But before I get into that process, we have to see the obligatory assembly shot. Because if you don't see a joint fit snugly together, then it definitely didn't, right? So with the joints fitting tighter than a turtleneck, I could move on to cutting the drawer bottom grooves. Now, normally drawer grooves are pretty straightforward because all you have to do is make the cut. But since I'm using box joints and I don't want those grooves to be exposed, I have to do a couple of stopped grooves so I don't cut through the joinery. To make that happen, I'm going to cut my grooves over at the router table. So once I have my 1/4 inch bit locked in place, I can nudge my fence over so that I have a 1/2 inch of space between the bottom of my drawer and the bottom of my groove. From there, I'll go ahead and cut the grooves into the bottom of my 4 drawer sides. For the drawer fronts and backs, I'm going to need to set up a few stops on my router's fence. And I'll just use a couple of knobs I have lying around to lock those stops in place. Then I can just carefully place my workpiece down on the spinning bit and cut it left to right as normal. The tricky part is cutting the right side, where I need to do a slight climb cut into the stop. The idea here is to make that climb cut as small as possible so that there's less risk of error. And to that point, if you're digging this video and these tips, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't risk missing a future upload. Plus, doing so really helps the video out, and I greatly appreciate your support. Next, it was on to cutting in the reliefs for the drawer fronts. Just like the doors, I want to create some added depth to the front of the drawers by carving in a couple of rectangular sections. These have the added benefit of giving a little more room for the pulls to be, well, pulled, so they're both a form and function element. Win-win. With the reliefs in place, I could add a couple of blocks to the end of my template for my grooves, then carve in the 1/4 inch strips. I love making jigs adaptable like this because if I can make one jig that serves 2 or 3 functions, it means a lot less setup and more time. Yep, all these wins got me feeling like T-Pain. So with the grooves looking pretty groovy, I could go ahead and use my chisels to clean up the rounded corners. When I'm cleaning up the rounded corners, I'm just trying to extend my existing cut lines to meet at 90 degrees. And normally when you're working with joinery, there's a slight overlay between your cut area and your joint, which allows for a little forgiveness if your chisel were to slip left or right. However, since these cuts are sitting front and center, I had to take my time to make sure that I cut things cleanly so I don't leave a bunch of marks on the front of my drawers. Next, I could get to work on the drawer bottoms. With most drawers, I opt to use 1/4 inch plywood that matches the lumber species of my project. But given that every other part of this build is going to be using hardwood, I felt like I had to keep it in the family. So the drawer bottoms here will be built from hard maple. Once I have my oversized panels trimmed down at the table saw, I can head over to the workbench to glue up my 2 panels. From there, it's back over to the table saw to trim them down to their final dimension, then it's on to assembly. Now, assembly for box joint boxes is pretty straightforward. As long as everything is cut correctly, the drawer boxes will only require a small amount of glue and they'll hold themselves square. I like to use 2 clamps on either end of my drawer boxes to apply even clamping pressure. I also place those clamps inside of the joints so that I'm not applying clamping pressure directly to the ends of my boards. With a few dabs of glue and a couple of whacks from a mallet, the drawer boxes are firmly sitting square. Next, it's on to one of the more complex and tedious parts of the process, and that's getting those protruding fingers flush with the sides and fronts of the drawer boxes. Now, if I were to just go at it with a random orbit sander, odds are I'd probably round over the edges and sides of my drawers. So instead, what I'll do is lightly hit those areas with my random orbit sander and pay super close attention to how much pressure I'm applying to avoid that rounding effect. From there, I can use a hand plane to even up the tops of the drawer boxes and remove any saw marks that still may remain from when I ripped the boards down. Once I'm onto the final fit and finish portion of the drawers, I'll hit those sides again with a hand plane just to even out any unevenness from the sanding. For now though, it's over to the table saw to trim the boxes down to their final height, which is just going to remove about 1/8 of an inch from the lower section. I chose to do this now instead of before I made the box joint because I feel it's a lot easier to align a 1/2 inch box joint on a half or whole number than it is a fraction of an inch. And speaking of fractions, I find that measure twice, cut once saves me about half the time and twice the headaches. But really, who's counting? Back over at the workbench, I could use a few hand planes to clean up the bottom of the boxes, then pop them in place to check the fit. And with all the work that went into these, I was ecstatic to see that I had a nice piston fit. From there, I could say something like, I'm happy with that. And I guess I did. Next, it was time to clean up the doors and fine-tune their fit. In part 1, I hung the doors, but there was still some odd gaps in the reveal, so here I'll use a couple of hand planes to fix those. I like to use a block plane for the end grain sections and a number 7 joiner for the edge grain portions. Whenever you hang doors, there'll probably be a panel or two that isn't perfectly square or flat, so you may have to work those areas a bit more to pass the eyeball test. And after a bit of trial and error, visually the doors were sitting pretty. So with the doors in place, I popped in my 1/4 inch dado stack and cut a couple of dados into a block for my walnut piping. I went back and forth on how I wanted to approach this and ultimately decided it was easiest to cut the joinery first and then plane the block to the proper thickness. I first tested a few pieces by ripping them down, planing them, and then cutting the dados afterward, but I got a ton of tear out that way and the fit wasn't as good as I hoped. Yeah, sometimes with small parts, it's a bit of a bear to get in that Goldilocks zone. So over at the planer, I placed the block with the dado side facing down and planed it down to the correct thickness. Since this piece will become the innermost piping on the doors, I'm aiming for 3/16 of an inch, which gives me just enough depth to accentuate those dramatic shadows I mentioned earlier. The real puzzle here was how to cut my thin strips without dropping them into the saw. And as it turns out, a bit of blue tape was the quickest and most effective solution. Once I had the strips ripped down, I brought them over to the workbench and positioned them so I could mark out their final length directly off the edge of the door. I left them slightly long on purpose because if I cut them exactly to the plan's dimensions, then there's a good chance they'd bump into each other when the doors swung open. The hinge placement affects the pivot point, so making sure the doors have enough clearance is key, otherwise they'd end up colliding. With my piping trimmed to its final length, I use a block plane to clean up any lingering saw marks. I had a pretty tight fit from the start, so I made sure not to remove too much material to avoid a loose fit. Once I was happy with the look, I popped the piping into place and tapped it home with a non-marring mount. After that, it was on to the final fit and finish for the drawer boxes. The first step was using a low-angle number 4 smoother to dress up the box joints. I mentioned earlier that I'd revisit these, and while the random orbit sander does a decent job removing material, it doesn't leave the same crisp finish that hand planes do. This step really makes the joinery pop. With the drawer boxes out, I could install the poles, which echo the same piping detail I used on the doors. Next, I could slide in the drawers and check that the doors function correctly with the drawers in place. Thankfully, they fit like a glove. Now it's on to making the shiplap for the rear panel. Here I'll be using hard maple planed down to 1/4 inch. The first step is to rip all my workpieces down to the same width, and at this point they're all going to be about a 1/2 inch wider than the panels need to be, and that's because shiplap overlaps. The plan here is to overlap each of my pieces by 3/8 of an inch, which will give me about a 1/4 inch reveal between each board. There's no exact science on how much space shiplap needs, but I aim for roughly 3/8 of an inch on the rabbets for most projects. The main thing is to clearly label your work pieces so you know which edges get the rabbet joints and which edges don't. Back at the table saw, I'll again just use my dado stack set to just below 1/8 of an inch or half the thickness of my material, along with a sacrificial fence to cut my rabbets. Now the reason I go just below half is because I want to have a little bit of room to clean up any saw marks or burning with the shoulder plane. Once I'm happy with the smoothness of the rabbet joint, I'll finish cleaning all the other edges up with a few hand planes. From there I could head to the rear of the cabinet and pop in the boards to check their fit. Making shiplap does come with a bit of trial and error the first go around, but after you do it a few times, the process is pretty straightforward and you'll be creating quick panels in no time. Next, it was time to trim down the panel for the top of the base and bottom of the case. Once I had it to the exact dimension of the case, I could cut in a 3/8 inch rabbet all the way around. Again, here I'll use my trusty dado stack to get the job done. By the way, I recently learned that Europe is allowed to have dado stacks now, so guys, welcome to your Discs of Death era. It's gonna be fun. Again, here to clean up those rabbets, I'll just use my shoulder plane. Since these rabbets wrap around the piece, there are a couple areas where I'm gonna have to work to make sure they match up, and that there are smooth transitions at each corner. With the top of the base done, it was time to get to work on the legs. Here I have a 1.5 inch chunk of tree that I need to cut down for my leg blanks. What I'll first do is cross cut the blanks square, and then from there I can rip them down. The legs on this piece are going to be the only angled element that I'm using in the design, but I think it works well to contrast with the square edges that repeat elsewhere. There are a lot of times in design where you need to break out of the box, and while I think overall that this piece is cohesively in the box in a good way, there is an opportunity to soften that a bit, so I'll do that here. I also like to think of bases like this in furniture more as a pedestal to showcase the main area of interest. And that's not to say that bases should be boring or lack inspiration, but that within good design, there's always room for balance. With the blanks cut out, I could take them over to the bench and lay out the miters. And to do that, I'll just use a combination of my miter gauge and a rule. I also like to mark out the areas where I'm going to be removing material on one blank and use that as my main setup workpiece. Visually, this just makes it easy for me to see what needs to be taken away and gives me a good idea of what the leg profile will look like when it's trimmed out. Plus, if I want to make any alterations, I can do so before I cut down the leg. So with my sled set up based on my layout, I clamped the workpiece in place and trimmed it down with the table saw. I like to use small but wide shop-made sleds for this sort of operation. Once I've made the initial cut, I can simply stick on a couple of reference blocks, rotate the sled, and use the opposite side for my second cut. This setup uses less material overall, and if I need to remake a part later, I don't have to disassemble or reconfigure another sled. And I for one love shop optimizations like that one, so let me know down in the comments if you guys would like to see more tips on how to conserve shop resources. So if that's something you'd like to see, start your comment with show me more. If not, start it with show me less. And as always, if you start your comment with show me more or show me less, I'll reply to you first because I know you're paying attention. With the legs sanded down, I could reference off the inside angle with my miter gauge and use that to lay out the rails for the base. I know I already had my miter gauge set up from when I cut the legs down, but at this point it's better to pull that angle directly off the workpiece than to assume it's correct. Once I have those angles in hand, I can use my miter gauge to set up my miter sled and trim out those rails. With the rails cut down to their final length, it was time to lay out the joinery. And for the joinery on the base, I'm just going to be using dominoes. Now, there's a few different routes I could have taken here, but honestly, floating tenons are the most effective way to achieve the final look I'm going for. So here I'll lay all my joinery out on one part, and then extend those lines onto my other parts. This way I can ensure everything will stay aligned when it comes time for assembly. From there I can lock in the dominoes settings and plunge in the mortises. Now, the reason I chose to go this route instead of using classic mortise and tenon joinery is because there are a couple of subtle angles in the splayed legs that would be a lot trickier with traditional joinery. And given that these floating tenons will be plenty strong to hold up this structure, I didn't feel it was worth the added hassle to go that route. As a woodworker, strategically cutting corners is kind of my thing. So after a few plunges of the 8mm bit, the mortises were cut and I could try out my first dry assembly. And thanks to some solid layout, everything came together as expected. Next on the Gantt chart was to glue the base to the bottom of the cabinet. I considered a couple different ways to attach the base, but ultimately just decided to glue it on. It's my belief that the base is part of the case, and even if in the future I want to remove the legs altogether, the base should remain. So after aligning all four sides, I could use a few F-style clamps to hold things in place. While the glue dried, I turned my attention to cleaning up the rails and stretchers. And to do that, I'll just use my block plane to remove any remaining saw marks. Once things had smoothed over, it was time to get the leg assembly assembled. I first like to start by gluing my dominoes into the horizontal parts, this way I don't have to address all the mortises at the same time. And once I have all the tenons in place, I move on to gluing and assembling the remaining parts. I think working this way really cuts down on the stress that comes along with glue ups and makes them a lot more approachable, especially when working with really large pieces. In just the opposite direction though, smaller pieces can be a bit trickier. So for assembling the piping, I decided to work through it in sections, meaning that I'm going to align the outer strip first, glue it in place, and then use it as my reference for my next piece of piping. I also found it easier to pop the horizontal pieces in place prior to attaching the second outer strip. This way all the parts were sitting in their final position while the glue cured, and I didn't have to worry about future misalignments. So while the lattice dried, I removed the clamps from the base and cabinet and carved out a mortise for my brand. Because without that, people may confuse this piece for a Frank Lloyd Wright original. So after I have the mortise cut, I can pop in my brass medallion and tap it home. Then from there it was on to the finish, and for the finish on this piece I'm going to be using a hard wax oil, better known as Rubio Monocoat. And I've talked a lot about the benefits of Rubio in the past, so I'm going to glaze over those here. But while I finish up the finish, let me take a moment to say thank you to you guys for watching and sharing these videos and supporting the channel. As many of you know, this isn't my full-time job, and I build and film these projects on nights and weekends. So having the support from you guys is incredibly rewarding. With that said, if you'd like to support the channel further, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon, where you'll get discounts on project plans, an invite to the Discord server where we can discuss what you're working on, what I'm working on, or whatever you want to talk about, plus a lot more access that you just can't get through YouTube alone. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, check out the link in the description. And for those of you who have already joined, thank you guys so much for your continued support. Your donations go directly towards these videos, so thank you. Alright, we're through the 7th inning stretch, and the next step is to install a few figure 8 fasteners for the leg assembly. I'm a really big fan of attaching bases this way because figure 8 fasteners do a really good job of concealing the hardware, plus they allow for some wood movement when necessary, and the installation is pretty straightforward. All you have to do is mark out the center point of your fasteners on your workpiece, then use a Forstner bit to pop in a quick mortise and clean up a bit of overhang with a chisel. From there, a self-centering drill bit with a few half-inch screws lock things in place. Over the years, I've tried a lot of different attachment styles, but none of them really compare to the ease and functionality of a figure 8 fastener. With the fasteners in place, I can flip the entire cabinet on end, center the leg assembly, and secure it with some half-inch screws. Now, due to the fact that the lattice and poles were going to be a hassle to finish while attached to the cabinet, I decided to wait until now to glue them in place. Earlier I taped off the areas that will get glue on the doors and drawer fronts, so here all I have to do is sand the rear portion of those walnut parts to expose the raw wood. Then I can carefully apply a bit of glue and secure them in place. While the glue cured, I could then pop in my shiplap rear panel. To attach the strips, I'm just going to use a couple 23 gauge pen nails. A 3/16 spacer ensures all my gaps are even. The final step was to attach the doors to the cabinet using the double offset hinges. Here's also where I'll replace those earlier used stainless steel screws with a couple of brass ones. Again, I didn't want to put a ton of wear and tear on these fasteners. So, while the door shuts on this project, all that's left now is to check out those glamour shots. This piece is one of the more challenging builds I've taken on in quite a while. And not just from a technical standpoint, although there was plenty of intricate work involved. When you're trying to live up to the legacy of your heroes, it's tough to step out of their shadows. But at the end of the day, I really do think Frank Lloyd Wright would give this design his nod of approval. And I know damn well it'll hold up better than some of his furniture. Just saying. My goal with this piece was to capture a period when modern design and fun collided. I think I managed to hit those marks, and I learned a lot in the process. Hopefully you picked up a few things too. I love the exposed joinery, the contrast in lumber species, and the way the organic forms in the wood veneer sit right alongside the strong horizontal and vertical lines. It all comes together in what I'd call a balanced piece, and one that will, with fingers crossed, last as long as Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy. So if you enjoyed watching this piece come together and you want to see more videos like it, check out this video over here next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.